This video is for my fellow teachers of contract drafting at Cardozo to illustrate uses of ChatGPT. I'll be using exercise 26D in the new edition, and I'll also be using a real public record engagement letter for investment banking services from my own work to make some illustrations. One reason I'm making this video is to prepare myself to learn more and more about ChatGPT so that in the middle of the semester I can make a student-focused video that will be derivative of this effort. I'll begin with a couple of observations and then work through the ChatGPT conversation I had earlier today that you can see on the screen. And then I'll close with a couple of additional observations. Uh, I think that the interaction between you, the drafter, you, the professional, and ChatGPT, the dialogue-like interaction, is the real benefit of ChatGPT for responsible use. Obviously, it is, dishonest, but I also think it's ineffective just to throw an assignment over to ChatGPT and expect it to do it for you. Not only does this not help a client or help a student learn, it also doesn't work very well. And so I think the cheating in our context is not very effective and will be pretty easy to detect. On the other hand, I think that ChatGPT used as a tool properly is a great help. And that's true both in a real working context and even at an exercise level context. Um, for the moment, my teaching partner this year, Grace Garrettson, and I intend to introduce ChatGPT to our students as being somewhat like a chainsaw, an extremely powerful tool, but one that has to be used with you fully alert, you fully in control, and you ready to handle everything. It's not something that can just be slung around as if it will safely do the work for you. All right, so much for that. Let me turn to this Chat GPT dialogue. I begin, as you can see, by telling ChatGPT who I am. I'm a commercial attorney with clients, and we're going to work on some contract drafting. I find that a little context setting for ChatGPT helps it work with me more effectively. I then begin to tell it in my own words the first part of exercise 26D, which is on page 418 of the third edition textbook. This is not an assignment that I think anyone gives to students, so I think it's a fine one to illustrate with here. I think it's especially good because I think AI does an especially fine job of helping with the drafting of numeric provisions and other highly technical provisions. So I tell it that my client is a small company that consigns used clothes to stores owned by others. And then I help it understand the jargon that I'm going to use. I tell it that the stores, which we call consigners, receive a percentage of the selling price. And then I'm working on a covenant that establishes this pay to consigners. Now ChatGPT does something very characteristic of it that you have to get used to and learn to, sort of ignore and work around. It tries to dive in and help well before it understands what you want. And you, if you're a student being a little bit lazy, you might use this as an off ramp from actually thinking yourself. This is letting the chainsaw take over. Instead, I just keep going and step it through step by step. And I think breaking what you're doing with ChatGPT down into steps is the way to get the best out of it. From the assignment, I give it the current draft, and the exercise tells you to improve on this draft. Notice that I haven't asked it to do anything yet, but it's already trying to improve the phrasing. This is another example of how ChatGPT tends to race ahead of you, and you just have to ignore that and go back to what you're trying to do. In this case, I did want to improve the clarity of this wording, and I redirect it. I tell it that what it did is too many words, but I like what it did up in section 1. And as you can see, section 1 here is the core of a usable answer to 26D. It's not right yet, and if you pause for a moment, you'll actually be able to identify a lot of the drafting problems that are in ChatGPT's first effort. A lot of these problems are so basic that they're the things that we teach to law students in this very class. So I go on to focus it on section 1, and I also tell it that I like having price brackets. I think that's important, and it's the first step that a student would actually have in answering this exercise effectively without AI. And then I tell it I want to clarify those price brackets. As you'll have identified, that's the problem with what it did. And it goes some way towards answering me, but it actually hasn't clarified the price brackets. I ask it a question that suggests the problem with the price brackets. This is actually very similar to a comment that any of us might give to a student in the margins of the work that they submit. I ask, are there any gaps in these brackets? And AI completely botches it. ChatGPT doesn't actually fix the problem. In fact, it falsely asserts that the brackets provided in the revised section cover all possible price ranges. Well, that's not true. And so I ask it a leading question. What happens if an item is sold for $999.50? Now ChatGPT gets it. And it realizes that the problem is that it hasn't actually given you contiguous price ranges, a very basic drafting problem. And then I now do something that both helps in this session, but also helps me learn how to better use ChatGPT as a tool. I tell ChatGPT that it has now resolved a gap, but that when I asked it before, you answered that there were no gaps. I want to get better at obtaining your assistance. What should I have done to have gotten a correct answer? ChatGPT does a fairly good job, which you'll recognize as being good tools for eliciting good input from clients, as to how to get better output from ChatGPT. It tells you to clarify edge cases, to ask for potential ambiguities, to request examples or scenarios, to iterate and test. All of these are things that we come around to encouraging our students to do with their clients as they improve their ability to translate a business deal into contract language. Okay, then I pretty much level set and I say, okay, fine, restate where we are right now and we'll go from there, which it does. I think this is a very helpful thing to basically break up your dialogue with ChatGPT into sections. It helps ChatGPT not get confused, and it also tends to limit what we saw at the beginning was this tendency of ChatGPT to run ahead of you. I think by telling it step by step that you are going step by step and that you're now going to the next set of steps, it somehow catches on to the fact that it needs to follow you in a more stepwise fashion, and that's more useful. I now have a direct suggestion. I don't really like $9.99 or below. I want to take a different phrasing choice. And I say, try revising this so that the first price range is expressed as less than 1,000, and then make the corresponding changes to the other price ranges. This is a good example of how impressive AI has become. ChatGPT's answer really does follow through the change to bullet point 1 correctly to bullet points 2 and 3. I think that's pretty impressive. I then ask it my first open-ended question. Based on what we've done so far, do you see any other last improvements? And here, it gives you a half helpful and half baffling answer. It suggests that you go from items sold for to items sold at. Although I don't want to do it, I think it's very helpful that it suggests differences in wording because you can consider it and it allows you to have some conviction as to why you're going with the wording you are going with. Or in another instance, it might very well provide you a prompt of a word that you do want, or make you think that there's some third word that you'd rather go with. But then there's this baffling second point that ChatGPT brings up of clarification of thresholds. Its point is correct, but it's already implemented in the drafting. It's asking you to do something that was already done. I'm not so sure I'm right about that at this point. And so I explain both things I've just said. I say I don't like the first change, so please reverse that. I didn't see how the second change shows up in the drafting. Would you please point that out to me? It then does that, and it sort of backtracks. one of the things that ChatGPT does is it acts like a very overconfident student. Even when it makes a mistake, it tends to minimize the acknowledgement of that mistake. It just sort of slides slightly into what you now help it realize is going on. And so I prompt it and I say, okay, your second point was an observation, but not a revision. Okay. It confirms that. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything that's useful. And then I tell it, all right, I've got what I need for part one of exercise 26D. Give it to me in a form to export. At this point, if I was a student or illustrating this to students, I would tell them that I would take it from here, I would put it into Word, and I would continue to work on it. For example, I'm not going to use bullet points, but I don't need ChatGPT to help me with that, nor do I need ChatGPT to do the whole assignment. But you can see how it's simultaneously true that a student or we can do this assignment without ChatGPT, and secondly, that it's just as much work to involve ChatGPT, but at the same time, it did do some things that were useful. And actually, through this transcript, you'll see that although useful, this first example is probably the least useful of the three examples I'll go through. So ChatGPT does have its value and is a tool, but remains an optional tool. I don't see anything in what ChatGPT does with exercises that makes me think that if I were a student, I would find it compelling, but I think I might find it very attractive. We now turn to the second part of exercise 26D, which sets up my own attorney's contingency fee for the same client because this client has gotten itself into a litigation with one of its consignors. So I tell it that we're now going to turn to a different task. And I think if you pivot from one task to a second task, you always need to be clear about that to ChatGPT, or it will conflate the two parts of your conversation. You'll see an example of this later. I tell it the basic fact pattern for the assignment. And as you can see, it's now back to jumping ahead. And I pull it back. I say, actually, I'd like to start with some rough drafting of my own, and then we can refine it. Hang on. I say hang on because there was actually a couple of minutes where I needed to tap out my first effort to do this assignment. I then realize that even to do that, I'm going to need to set up some defined terms, attorney and client, and I tell them what those defined terms are. I find that ChatGPT is quite good at understanding defined terms. I then provide my first effort at doing the assignment, both because none of us do these things perfectly, no matter how many years of experience we have, and also because I've deliberately made this a sort of flawed and somewhat student-like answer. I've given it a first draft that clearly needs a lot of work. Nevertheless, it gets across the substance. ChatGPT goes ahead without being asked and tries to improve on this drafting, and also tries to suggest some key points to consider. Notice that it is doing a number of things that we teach students in contract drafting. It is breaking things into points, subdividing nicely, and providing relatively short, understandable sentences. I would also say that it's sequencing the points it's establishing pretty well. That hourly rate is the basis of everything else in the assignment. One of its key points to consider is quite a good one. It's one that we would congratulate an ambitious student for noticing, which is that the exercise really only pivots from a discount fee to a premium fee if our client has avoided a payment of damages to the plaintiff that's adverse to them. But there are other kinds of payments that our client will feel identically to a payment of damages, but will not actually be damages. One would be a payment that comes out of a settlement. And that's prompted by ChatGPT. Maybe you want to talk about something like court-ordered damages and settlements. You can see that in its key point too. So I point that out. I say that settlement point is a good one. And maybe we should also consider whether my client being required to pay attorneys' fees of their adversary should count as well. In other words, that prompt from ChatGPT helps me on my own think of yet a third thing. And then I ask how we could do that. ChatGPT goes ahead and tries to do that. You can see that it sets up definitions in its section for damages, settlement, adversaries, attorneys, fees. That's useful. But I now begin to see other refinements. I've noticed, for example, that total build time in connection with the representation is a mouthful that I'm repeating over and over, and that ChatGPT is repeating even more often. I suggest that we create a defined term that refines that. And so it creates this idea of build time. This is a good move, and it's something we would recognize as progress in a student's ability to draft. I now go to the point I was making earlier. I tell ChatGPT that the economic function of damages, settlement, and adversaries' attorneys' fees is identical. So let's combine those into concepts into one general defined term to streamline. It then proceeds to do this. Here, I'd like to step back a little bit and point out what I think is the key to having a skilled use of ChatGPT. You can never sit back. The prompts that you give ChatGPT need to be specific, need to be affirmative, need to kind of tell it where to go in the next step. To have those skills, you actually have to be a good human attorney who isn't dependent on ChatGPT. In other words, the students need to learn the substance of what we're teaching them in this class in order to make good use of ChatGPT. There's no royal road. They're going to actually have to learn the skills they have always had to learn, even before AI was anything available, in order to make good use of this tool. But if they learn those old skills, they are then able to use those old skills combined with this new tool to get some pretty impressive results that they might well not have gotten or not gotten for a while as an attorney starting out in the way that you and I did. At any rate, we now have this idea of adverse payments, which combines all these various forms of, indeed, adverse payments. I don't particularly like that as a defined term, but ChatGPT has gotten me pretty close. And so I just tell it to use the defined term adversary payments instead. As a matter of fact, I don't really see much of a difference between the two, but for illustrative purposes, I've gone ahead and quibbled with the choice of defined terms, and you'll see that ChatGPT has no difficulty implementing that request. At that point, I have an answer to the second part of exercise 26D that I think has gotten to the point where I should take over in Word and continue to work on it, format it, think about it, refine it. And so I tell ChatGPT that I'm ready for that. I'll now transition from a classroom exercise to an actual live piece of professional work. I've taken a recent engagement letter of mine that's in the public record, and I think it's very important to remember that ChatGPT needs a lot of work when it comes to privacy and privilege and client confidences before you can use it safely. And so the slight unreality here is I'm taking a final engagement letter and I'm acting as if it's an advanced draft and I'm trying to continue to revise and improve that draft. That's the premise of this section of the ChatGPT dialogue. So I give it an investment banking engagement letter. And I tell it that we want to call it the agreement. That way it's not calling it the document, and we have a basis for talking about what we're working on. Here I ask it to do something that I think ChatGPT usually does fairly well. I ask it to summarize the basic commercial purpose of the document in a few sentences. That's pretty competently done by ChatGPT here. It identifies the party, it succinctly identifies the services to be provided, and it makes clear that there are reciprocal fee and expense payments being provided for the benefit of the investment bank. I now go to asking it to do some just digestion of the document. And this is something you would expect ChatGPT to be really, really good at. And here's a caution. I think that it can be good at that, but it makes a surprising number of basic mistakes. You'll see one here. I ask, were there previous agreements? If so, please tell me a little bit about them. Now, in fact, this engagement letter refers to two previous agreements. One, a prior agreement that was amended and restated, and second, a confidentiality agreement that's incorporated into this engagement letter. ChatGPT only identifies the prior agreement. It does summarize it well. I then push back and you have to know how to push back with ChatGPT. And I ask, is that the only prior agreement mentioned? ChatGPT incorrectly pushes back on me and says, yeah, that's the only one. I respond, what about the confidentiality agreement? Now suddenly, and with complete confidence, ChatGPT responds, oh yeah, there's a second agreement. This is a classic thing that I think needs to be emphasized to anyone using ChatGPT, including our students, which is the kinds of mistakes that lazy use of ChatGPT will lead you into are so unprofessional as to be malpractice in a working context, and so basic as to result in a low grade in a classroom context. It will make mistakes if you're not paying attention and involving it in your own work as an assistant rather than handing it over to ChatGPT. And that's just exceedingly important. You cannot expect it even to get a count of other cross-referenced agreements right. You've got to be careful. We can go a little further than that, though. I ask it, so that I can work with you better in the future, can you tell me how I could avoid your making that mistake in the future by my asking questions differently? And guess what? It gives a very helpful answer to that. It asks me for specificity. It gives me a very interesting point, and I think it's the best point in point two. It says to use words like, please review the word being entire document for any mentions. In other words, you want to cue ChatGPT when you see mistakes like this by directing it to avoid those mistakes. And I think in the future, what I've learned from this interaction with it is I need to tell it to review the entire agreement. I now have it do a different bit of digestion and analysis. I say this agreement uses capitalization to indicate defined terms. What are the defined terms used in this agreement? Arranged in order of frequency of use. It then struggles a little bit with the format of the document I fed to it, not surprising given that it came from Edgar. And I tell it, when it gives me a choice between various ways of digesting this document, to manually review it. Now, finally, it comes around to what I was asking for, a list of defined terms arranged by the frequency of use. I think any of us can see how a list like this, which has the defined term, the number of uses, and a succinct paraphrase of what the defined term means, that's highly useful in practice. I can readily see finding a way, if it's a public record or maybe anonymizing sufficiently or in some other appropriate way, feeding it indentures or other really long agreements and getting it to provide me a digest of definitions. That's a very helpful thing to do. I now ask, are there any defined terms that lack a definition? Are there any undefined terms? I've spelled that out a little more. We would all know what an undefined term is, but I'm not sure that it does, so I say it in more words. It checks, and it tells me that no, it did not find any undefined terms. Given that this is my letter, that's a little bit of a relief. But then it brings up adversary payments and adverse payments. That's from back in the Tina Stark and Monica Lorente textbook exercise. That's nothing to do with a live, real engagement letter. You see how even if you signpost for ChatGPT, you sometimes have to reinforce that it should not conflate prior efforts with a separate effort later. So I tell it that when we discussed earlier, that was a completely different task, so please keep it separately. And I think from that point it does. I now tell it to focus on the fee section, which happens to be section 2. And I ask it, are there any contradictions or calculation problems in the fee structure? This kind of open-ended, do you see any issues? Issue spotting, I think, is never a substitute for our own issue spotting, but helps us be more confident that we're not missing some major range of possible issues that may come up. Let's look at what it comes up with. The minimum aggregate financing fee clause. There's a minimum fee, as is often the case. And I think it completely botches the details of why this is a potential problem. I don't think the content of what it says in these bullet points is anything really but gobbledygook. But the fact is, I should focus on the minimum aggregate financing fee. So the heading is useful and right. The content in this case is not so great. Well, it actually goes down from there. Overlap between restructuring and sale fee. Well, that's obviously a concern, but it happens that there's a provision that specifically and exactly addresses that. ChatGPT seems not to understand that. It then points out other issues, the sale fee calculation, and we'll come to why that actually is an issue. Financing fee reductions, we'll come to why that really is an issue. And then multiple fees clause, which again is something that's completely inadequately addressed. It's not actually a problem, but it is a topic that had to be addressed. The only difference is that it really was addressed. It's already correct in the drafting. So you see, again, the point is not that you can rely on ChatGPT, and the result you'll get from someone who nevertheless does rely on it is going to be either malpractice or something you'd grade very low. But if you're thinking and using this as a sort of dialogue between a very patient colleague that's actually available in the middle of the night and yourself as you're working through your own work, I think it's quite valuable. But I wanted to press on that point too, because it gave me a moment of fear. I'm like, wow, what if this thing is identified that I haven't really dealt with something that's both a restructuring and a sale? What if I really haven't addressed that overlap? And so I point it to the section that I thought does address it. I say, regarding your point two, what is the relevance of section 2G1? It says that it's relevant, and then it talks about it a good bit, and it comes to the correct conclusion that that section directly addresses the overlap concern. And notice the somewhat hedging response, which you might recognize, from a colleague, from a student, or indeed for yourself. Its last sentence is, the existence of this clause mitigates the potential problem I initially pointed out, though it's always worth confirming that the details align with the company's overall strategic and financial objectives. That's a pretty crab-like motion out of being caught. We now turn to aggregate consideration. As in most investment banking letters, this is a half-page long, highly dense definition. It's also one that, unlike what we teach in class, we do not subdivide a great deal because it's generally to the benefit of an investment bank to avoid having a client look at every element of that definition. And so, as I've occasionally pointed out towards the end of a semester in drafting context, in drafting contracts, some of the things that you learn in class, you eventually learn to reverse when you do not want to necessarily expose every detail to the scrutiny of someone who's not going to their own trouble of looking at every word. So I ask ChatGPT to break down this long, dense definition for me, and it does so. These are pretty much direct quotes from the definition, and that's true even though ChatGPT presents them as if they are paraphrases. And ChatGPT often does this when it's dealing with fairly technical prose. It does not adjust the language, even though it tells you that it's giving you an explanation of that language. So you have to be careful there. I then pose to it a pretty real-world question. This effort in the aggregate consideration definition that investment banks use to deal with retained value is often quite elusive to new lawyers or indeed to clients. It takes some explanation. And I pretend, for the purpose of this illustration, to be having that problem. And I asked ChatGPT, I say the fourth point is hard for me to understand. Would you explain it to me conceptually and then give me two hypothetical examples with real dollar amounts to help me understand? This is something that ChatGPT tends to do very well. I think its conceptual explanation is pretty good. ChatGPT, and I'm sure this is what troubles English professors, especially in universities, ChatGPT seems to be pretty good at giving you a 5-paragraph essay. That's not typically what we want in contract drafting, which helps because it means that the cheating problem is probably not as acute for us as it would be for English professors. But it also means that we can exploit that in our work. The 3-paragraph, in this case, definition or explanation rather of this retained earnings element is pretty good. Its examples are even better. And I think looking through these examples actually does help someone understand how this dense language would work in practice. I then asked ChatGPT to take that further. I say, would you go ahead and calculate Stifel's sale fee for your 2 examples? It then works those out. And as you can see, as is often the case in investment banking letters, there's a sort of tiered fee for sales. You want to incentivize an investment banker to get the highest sale price, so you pay them a higher percentage in the event that they get a higher price, 2, 3, 4, 5%. These look pretty good. And now I begin to ask it to help me revise in a way that I think would be a struggle for a lot of even experienced lawyers. I say that, as you just observed, the sale fee has a tiered fee structure based on amounts of aggregate consideration. The calculation jumps by full percentage points. But what if I wanted a fee that increases smoothly, not jumps, but increases smoothly? But it intersects with the same percentages. How could I change the sale fee section to accomplish this? I think in this entire illustration, this is the most real world helpful thing that you'll see ChatGPT do. It starts by providing you the calculus, and it can be expressed in calculus terms, of how you would get a smoothly increasing sale fee that doesn't jump by percentage points, but actually responds by giving you a nice smooth slope that's not tiered. It's helpful to see this, and obviously this is a presentation of the math that many lawyers, myself included, would struggle to provide, certainly in any timely way. It then goes ahead and shows how you can implement that in the agreement. And much to my relief, it accomplishes two things. In its suggested drafting, it avoids calculus. That's a good thing. And secondly, it appears to be technically correct. As far as I can tell, it has accurately implemented this. And you can see that it's done it with, fairly simple equations. I would be comfortable in some contexts even using equations like this in contracts. And indeed, Tina Stark and Monica Lorente show that this is available as a method of presenting mathematical calculations and numeric formulas in the textbook. It talks about how it works. It provides examples. It's really quite an impressive presentation. I tell it that that's the numeric result I want, but I want to phrase it in language similar to the agreement. In other words, I don't really want those formulae. Specifically, I say I'd like to avoid mathematical formulaic expression and instead use sentences such as are used in business contracts. How could I do that? It then tells me how it might do that. Now, I think at this point it's retreating too far from being formulaic and basically telling you what you would need to develop on your own. It's basically giving the reader of the contract instructions for the reader to draft what would need to be done to implement the idea. It goes too far back from implementation to mere business idea. It sort of untranslates the idea. That said, as a drafter, I think I've gotten what I need out of ChatGPT. I have kind of the two poles, one too notional, the other too technical, of what I'm trying to accomplish, even though both are accurate. And so what I can do at this point is step back from ChatGPT, take these two alternatives, open up Microsoft Word, and go from there. I tell it that I'm doing that and I'm going on to a new subject. I tell it to turn to a section that I think is too hard to read, and I ask it to redraft in ways that don't change the meaning. The reason I'm asking it that for purposes of this illustration is I think that in total contrast to the numeric provisions above, where I think it provides a lot of value pretty consistently, asking it to be a better wordsmith tends to be where it falls the most short, and really you should do it yourself. You're going to be far better at phrasing than ChatGPT is. It provides some suggestions. But I go ahead and let it know that I want to go back to the original language. I don't think those suggestions are particularly valuable. Now I ask it to help me iterate and kick the tires on the actual fee calculations to see if there are any anomalies. This financing fee, as is often the case with dollar calculations in commercial drafting, has a couple of exceptions. One is that there are a couple of entities that if they finance, there's a cut rate or discount fee. And the other is that there's a minimum financing fee. So I give it part of that fact pattern. Suppose that there is a financing for which the investor is one of the discount investors. They finance the company in the following ways: 100 of senior secured, 50 of unsecured convertible, and 25 of preferred. and I ask it, what is the fee? Now we're back to the strengths of ChatGPT. Notice how beautiful and stepwise it analyzes how to calculate the fee. That's very well done, and this is accurate. I now want to challenge and see whether or not it understands the minimum fee exception. So I say, okay, but if the investment is only half of that, but with the same components and proportions, what is the fee then? The minimum fee is 1.5 million. It goes through the same calculations, and it comes to the answer that would be correct if there wasn't a fee minimum, but it forgets the fee minimum. The fee minimum is 1.5, and it tells you that the answer should be 1.375. That's wrong. I then ask it, and I'm not sure why in this transcript why it's missing here, but I then ask, are you sure? And it runs through it again, and it comes to the same wrong answer again. I then say, have you noticed the fee minimum? And here I'm going to have to illustrate because for some reason the transcript isn't showing my questions. And it says, you're correct to bring up section 2E2. Once again, you have this overconfident crab-like motion away from a mistake that it's clearly made. And it's getting that answer correctly. Here's the question down here. I ask, doesn't that specify a minimum fee? Now I get back to why I went through all this from a real-world drafting perspective. The fact that ChatGPT made a mistake in applying a fee section makes me worry that maybe I haven't been clear enough in stating how my exceptions work. And in effect, I think the problem that I may have with this fee, and this is a common, more sophisticated drafting problem that we would experience in practice and our students probably aren't going to encounter in class, is that when you have multiple exceptions to a general fee, those exceptions sometimes don't interact in ways that we've specified. The interplay between exceptions is often problematic. But to begin, I asked ChatGPT, does your mistake indicate a problem with the drafting? It tries to answer this, and these are, this is all good food for thought. But I don't think that any of this is something that I would actually use. It's not that I think it's useless. I'm glad that I thought through everything that it answers. It's just that none of it really hits the bullseye. Now I provide it what I think the answer is. I've realized, partly prompted by ChatGPT walking me through good answers that don't hit the bullseye, I think to myself, the problem is my two exceptions don't have a clear relationship to each other. So I asked ChatGPT to think back to its original answers. If the investor had been neither Elysium nor EP Resources, the two discount investors, but an unnamed investor, would you have made the same mistake about the minimum? It then tells me that I'm right to focus on clarifying how the exceptions interact. And although it's jumped up here in the transcript, my response is, okay, so I think I need to clarify how those two exceptions interact, which is indeed the issue. I'll stop with the transcript here. I think what you can see, and I think what I'm learning as I continue to work with this, is that very much like a chainsaw, if you are attentive and you are active and you are in control and hands-on, you can get a lot of value out of ChatGPT. In the real world, I think one of the most valuable things colleagues do for one another is sit down and help people, help one another, chew over a difficult piece of drafting. But I think with colleagues at my level of practice and probably yours, it's a lot of fun to talk about high level, high concept issues that really flatter the intelligence of the colleague whose time you're taking. But I'm a little reluctant to walk into one of my colleagues' offices and get them down into the nitty gritty of the numerator and denominator of a fee calculation. I feel like I'm burdening them too much. Or maybe even low rating the level at which we all like to imagine ourselves working. But in reality, we all have to do the nitty gritty work, and it's useful to talk through that nitty gritty drafting. Here in ChatGPT, I have a dialogue partner that can help me at that nitty gritty level in a way that I'm not at all reluctant to do. I don't really have to worry about having to be too ground level or too technical or too gradual with a non-human dialogue partner. In the course of that, it prompts me to improve drafting. It sometimes can be allowed to do some of the work of providing suggested revisions to drafting. And also, as you saw at the beginning of the real world example, it can help me digest long agreements by providing summaries, lists of definitions, and so forth. But in ways, as we saw when it misunderstood how many cross-referenced agreements there were, in a way that sometimes has really basic mistakes that we can't rely on. Coming back to the exercises, I think you can see that it would be very difficult to directly cheat using ChatGPT. Someone who just lazily sits back and throws one of Lorente and Tina Stark's exercises into ChatGPT is going to get an answer that we would grade very low and also probably recognize as being automated responses. On the other hand, someone who does, candidly, I think as much work as they would have to do if they did the work on their own, to work the problem with ChatGPT as a tool will probably have gained two benefits. One, all of the benefit of drafting contracts that we hope they get each semester we teach it. But secondly, they are probably beginning to get a grip on how to effectively use AI as a tool in drafting, something that I think all of us predict will be a very important part of the arsenal of tools that our young students will deploy over the many future decades of their careers. This is the end of the video.